welcome. Thanks for joining us today. This is going to be the first part of a couple-part series. Today we're here to discuss and describe our experiences and expertise regarding medtech proof of concept. Here at Synchro, we've been developing software for the medtech industry for over 30 years. And during that time, we've completed successfully several hundred projects. And our panelists today will not only share their expertise and insights, but also give you some direct experiences that they've had as it relates to proof of concept. And following the presentation, we'll also have a Q&A time for everybody that's on if they'd like to answer or ask questions rather, and we'll just queue them up. So at the end, we'll ask those panelists your questions. So again, we are Synchro Medical. We develop software for the medtech industry. You can see that we have a variety of different companies that we've worked with over the years. A lot of them large and a lot of them are small companies as well. So we do not discriminate. We work with companies basically of all size and capacity. We have about 50 US-based engineers, and our engineers have on average about 15 years of experience. So it's a pretty tenured group of folks. All right, so now most importantly, let's meet the team of folks that you're going to be hearing from today. And again, at the end, just to remind you, if you have questions, just queue them up and we'll get to them at the end. So Rick Fisher is our VP of Engineering. Rick ensures that Synchro Medical engineers deliver consistently, and through his team of technical project managers, Rick provides oversight and direction for each of our projects. And Rick joined Synchro Medical back in 1997, so kind of ties back to the whole tenure of the folks that we have. Rose Marcantonio is our Director of Quality and Process. Rose has been working as a software engineer manager in the biomedical industry for more than 25 years. And during her 17 years of leadership roles at Synchro Medical, she has managed a variety of projects for instrument and system software as well as mobile devices. Rose leads the Synchro Medical assurance efforts and focus on improving internal project management and agile processes. So again, Rose will be one of the folks you'll hear from today. And then last but definitely not least, we have Frank Bergmeyer, who's the Director of Architecture and Design. Frank has been working as a software engineer, architect, and manager for over 25 years. And during Frank's 20-year plus tenure here at Synchro, he's worked primarily on FDA-regulated medical devices, clinical laboratory instrumentation, and automation. A lot of Frank's work is also centered on creating software architecture for new products and revitalizing existing products with new technology. So let's get into our first question, which is rather an obvious one given the title of the subject matter today. So what is a POC, or a proof of concept? Rick, do you mind kicking us off here?
Sure. So proof of concept is really a rapid development cycle to create software. So what we're doing here is we're trying to solve some sort of a question or help with defining requirements. You know, we might be doing a technical proof of concept where we're looking at some technical challenges. We might be looking at answering some workflow problems, or maybe even trying to get marketing some answers to how software might work for a system.
Great. Real quick follow-up question to that. Is there a difference between a POC and a prototype? I mean, a lot of conversations, I hear them kind of interchange, but I just wanted to clarify that before we kind of dive into some of the other questions that we have out here.
Not really. I mean, we often use those terms interchangeably. So, you know, a proof of concept and a prototype really can think of them as the same thing.
Great, thank you. And could any of you, including obviously Rose and Frank, provide an example of a POC project that you've worked on either recently or in the past?
Sure. So I can give one that we did probably a couple years ago, because we're now actually into the development cycle for this product. But it was a product that we were developing that was adding a new BLE Bluetooth piece to it. And since it was new to this environment, the client really wanted to technically prototype how that Bluetooth communication was going to work and function within their software. So we broke off kind of a proof of concept project or phase to look at how we could handle this communication. Would we be able to handle the distances and the environments? This was used in a cardiac cath lab, so we wanted to make sure that the environment didn't interact with what we were doing, as well as the high data rate and real-timeness that we needed for this solution to make sure that it was going to work all the way from the hardware through to the software.
Great. So moving on and getting a little bit deeper, when does our audience need or should they consider a POC? Rick, do you mind starting again?
No, sure. Really a proof of concept can be done anytime. And it's really anytime you have questions that you need to answer that you don't want to do as part of your product development cycle. So, being able to work in a more rapid development pace to answer questions about any of those things that I mentioned previously, but doing it quickly. So, anytime is really a good time to break out a proof of concept.
Okay. And some of the things or some of the folks that would be involved in a proof of concept, and I think you touched on a couple of these, Rick, I would imagine there can be either an internal support for that proof of concept, meaning you want to expand upon something or see if like as an example, a mobile device or a pilot app would be worthwhile in developing. And then there's also some external, possibly funding related impetus behind a POC. Are there different goals for internal and external stakeholders, meaning the impetus for the POC?
I can pick up this question.
Excellent.
So I think from my point of view, this is really about knowing your audience, right? So largely it's the same job, that you're looking to, get folks buy-in for the new product, kind of moving things forward. But depending on, whether internal or external, they may have different goals. So I have a client that internally, things were heavily based around like technical proof of concept, but for external funding, what they really wanted to see was to have everything up and running, at least in prototype form. So for that client, there was a lot of work during like the proof of concept phase where we were making sure things were operating as a whole. So different internal, external goals.
Excellent. Thank you. Just to expand upon that a little, not necessarily that, but the idea of when you need a POC. Rose, have you ever experienced an instance where you've done multiple or, at least a couple POCs for a single project?
Sure. We had a project for a drug delivery system, and the first thing they wanted to do was a proof of concept just to prove out the technology. Is this even feasible? And so we worked through that and then got to that point where we're like, yes, this is feasible. Let's start development. And then the next question was, well, what's this app going to be? So we needed to start to do a proof of concept of the workflow. What's important to the user and how should the user get there and different aspects. So we did multiple proofs of concept for this client.
Last question on this subject matter. I would imagine one of the keys is kind of defining the goals of a POC. Would that be something that a firm like us or even internally, the customers would need to kind of look at and define? And how do they go about that?
Yeah, I can answer that, JR. Goals are really important to lay out because otherwise your proof of concept can just go on endlessly. And if you really put boundaries around what you're trying to do, not that you can't change them because as you're working through an iterative process, you can always change or expand your goals. Sometimes your answers are going to change what your goals actually are as well. But if you don't start to confine what you're trying to do, you can really spend too much time in that proof of concept phase when really what you're trying to do is create a product that you can get to market.
Excellent.
And I'd say, JR, another piece of that is we can help our clients with that process. So if they're not quite sure what needs a proof of concept or not, we can work with them to help define the goals and to help keep them on track.
So other thing I'm hearing is even if you don't have a true steadfast goal, just at least starting down the process of identifying whether you should do a POC, it shouldn't be a reason not to consider it, I guess would be the point, correct?
Right.
Well, thank you. So let's move on to the next question, and going a bit beyond POC, or at least differentiating it from an MVP. So how are POCs different from an MVP? And I guess the first way to start that, if you don't mind, is could we define what an MVP or a minimal viable product is?
So the minimal viable product, is just that. It's product, where the proof of concept is really figuring out what your product's going to be. So an MVP, it's typically around, a set of requirements, a set of features, that are saleable. Sometimes it's used as the basis for like initial FDA submission. So Rick, I think you've had some experience with that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we did a project where what the client really did is they took their MVP, their minimum viable product, and that was what their submission was to the FDA. But the it didn't mean that they didn't do proofs of concepts in that project as well. But the minimum viable product was something that was developed under process. It was ready to go. So it was a shippable product. It was done under medical device software process, 62304.
Excellent. Rose, please tell us about the differences, really from a quality perspective. And I know that Frank and Rick kind of touched on it in the regulatory sense, but if you don't mind diving just a bit deeper for our audience, that would be great.
Sure. So an MVP, as we said, is going to be a commercial product. So that has to get submitted to the FDA or whatever regulatory body. And that has to follow the regulatory process. So from a documentation standpoint, from particularly documentation standpoint, whereas a proof of concept is something that we're trying to do quickly. And so we don't want to do all of that process because that would just slow us down.
Right, I think that might be a key that I'm hearing so far, is just the ability to be nimble and move quickly with a POC as opposed to an MVP, which is actually a product. Again, it's minimal, but it's still a product nonetheless. So you're not burdening a POC by those regulatory factors, and thus can move and can change pretty quickly as well. So let's move on to the next question of how do I get started developing a POC for my product? And Rose, I know you just answered the last question, but if you wouldn't mind starting us off here again as well, that would be great.
Sure. I mean, one of the things we talked about was to have some goals defined. So if our clients, potential clients, would have goals defined, that would be a good place to start, because then a project manager would work with the client to set timelines and goals for the project, for the proof of concept as well, and work through the different steps of what do you want to do and what sequence.
Okay, excellent. I know one of the things we always talk about when we're speaking with our customers is the ability to iterate and to be flexible and kind of show along the way what that work looks like. And again, it sounds like this would be especially feasible when you're doing a POC. So just delve in a little bit about iteration and what that kind of looks like, especially as it's related to a POC, if you don't mind.
Sure. Basically, what we want to do is have a short duration defined, and we do some of the work, and then at the end of that, what we call a sprint, we would demo it. And that way we could see, did we achieve what we need? What's the next steps? And then do it again and keep getting feedback every step of the way.
Excellent.
Yeah. Kind of one thing to add to that, JR, during a POC, during a proof of concept phase, we might do a 1 week sprint or maybe even shorter. Whereas during the actual product development or the MVP, as we were talking about earlier, that might be more of a 3 week sprint, because there's more process and more things that need to be done there. So the the turnaround time is more involved. But in that POC, like you said, we want to be nimble.
Yeah, I can echo that. So, really this is about getting answers as quickly as we can to questions that we have about that future product. And based on the answer, it may mean that we may need to change direction, and then we would do that over the next iteration cycle.
Yeah, I can think of a client that we had that was doing a novel cardiac instrument. And so because it was new, they didn't know what it needed to look like. The technology was proven, but they would try to come up with, okay, let's look at this. So we would create something and they'd see it and they'd look at us and say, wait, that's not quite what we thought that would look like. And this way we were able to respond quickly and try something else again until we got the right UI, that, the right display for them.
And the other thing I'm hearing, I keep throughout this discussion, is that really a tight time frame should not be a reason to not consider moving forward or even considering a POC, because you can be so flexible and you're not necessarily dealing with live data, et cetera, et cetera. Great. Well, let's move on to the next question. Do I, or better yet, do potential customers out there or folks need to consider or need to have a defined process? Rose, kind of based on your process responsibility, could you start us off? It seems like a logical place to begin.
Yeah, I'd say that someone wouldn't have to have a defined process at all, because this, we do software, so we have a process in place. As I said earlier, it wouldn't be the same process as for an MVP or a commercial product, but it's still some process, and we'd be iterating and we'd be working through things quickly to get to an answer. That's really the main process that we would be following. So nobody has to have anything defined, though.
Okay, excellent. Rick, do you have an example, maybe top of mind, that you could kind of give us from kind of a quick process or almost an undefined process as you've experienced the POC?
Yeah, I mean, one project we did recently, there was a piece, and again, it was another mobile app that we did, a different one where we were connecting to a new drug delivery system, and it was something that our client had never done, and actually we don't believe is in the market at all right now. So we really went into really just a phase with the client at the start of the project where we just tried to figure out ways to do things, try to do the communication. One of their goals that they had thought that they might want to do is very minimal user interaction with the device or with the app. So we really kind of worked through some things collaboratively to come up with a flow that we could do. We did that really quick, in a couple of weeks with a few iterations. And then we're able to get right on to the development phase. So to start to take that so that they could build into their requirements and other things that they needed to start making it a product.
It seems to be that we would uncover or be able to uncover different problems, et cetera, that might even manifest themselves with a larger project as part of a POC. Have you guys seen that in your experience?
I can think of a case where we're working on the product and some requirements changed for, I'll say, for age of majority. And so now we needed a whole new workflow to handle children becoming adults, and how do you deal with that in the data and all that. And so it was a perfect opportunity for a quick proof of concept to work through that.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. So really moving on now, and want to delve into a bit differently, and we've kind of touched on this throughout, but who should be involved in a POC? And I recognize that those stakeholders might be different given if it's an external focus or an internal focus. But Frank, do you mind going into, kind of describing who should be involved? And again, I imagine there might be different flavors to this answer depending on if it's a technical flair or if it's internal or external.
Right. I think that's a key point. What are the goals of the proof of concept? If it's more on the technical side, you're going to have a different set than, let's say, if you were doing some sort of user study around workflow. So on the technical side, it's probably, there's always representation from the business, but most likely, just more focused on the engineering, and proving things out to get information that's probably going to be rolled up into a bigger picture question around that proof of concept. Whereas for the more user-facing parts of a proof of concept, you're going to have input from marketing. You're going to have a lot more interaction, with probably a wider group to get your proof of concept completed.
One follow-up to that, Frank. Have you ever seen an instance where there's too many stakeholders or too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will, involved in a POC that slowed it down? And have you ever had to kind of take a step back and reset kind of as a group?
I certainly have. So for a digital microscope project, the way things started around the proof of concept, it was almost everybody in the company, all parts. Manufacturing, folks working with customer service. It was really wide reaching. It was good information, but unfortunately it also kind of made it hard, at least to get things rolling. What I really recommend is more of a targeted set of representatives for stakeholders so that things are more focused. You can come to decisions more quickly, and then you can start to bring in others in the larger corporation or company that you're working with.
Yeah. One thing I'll add to that, JR, is, sometimes even the end users might become involved with a proof of concept. You might want to actually take the system out and kind of demo it to people, obviously not treating or doing what is the device is intended for, but getting feedback from your end users of, is this the right workflow? Is this going to work in your environment? Does this give you what you need? So sometimes being able to take that proof of concept to the end user is really helpful for our customers.
It sounds like the theme throughout is, again, at least having some level of goal setting and who you're trying to build this for, to avoid that whole scenario, Frank, that you were discussing, and that Rick you kind of finished there, which is not having too many people involved to slow you down and not truly understanding what the end goal of the POC is. Well, great. Well, let's move on to what I believe is our final question, and then we'll go through some kind of key takeaways from what we've gone over, just to reiterate things. So what should I or anyone avoid during the development of a POC? Rick, do you mind kicking us off?
Sure, and I think we kind of talked about a number of these, but kind of to summarize them a little bit, things, too many people involved at the wrong stages. You might change who's involved with the POC as it evolves. Not setting goals, not really having a defined questions that you're answered, not setting a timeline that you really are trying to do so that it just doesn't meander or wander around. Those are really important things to keep in mind while you're doing it. Another thing to keep in mind, that you really want to do for a POC is not try to make it a product. I'll pick on marketing here because we're technical and we like to, but it looks like it's a working product sometimes, and it feels like, oh my gosh, we're almost there, and look at how little time we spent. But it really it doesn't have anything behind it. It's not real. So sometimes you got to kind of set those expectations that that it's not done. This is not the product yet.
Right, and I think we touched on that earlier with just it's not regulatory in nature. It's designed to be quick. You're not dealing with live data in many cases, so therefore, exactly what you said, Rick. It's not something that's designed to be the product, but rather a sampling, and then meant to be expanded upon once we kind of delve into the true development of that particular product or project. Does anybody have an example of maybe something that's kind of gotten away from you or during a project with involving a POC?
So I've had projects where we're trying to do two things at one time. So it's proof of concept, but we're already bringing in parts of process. There's usually the question of, can I recycle, what we've done in proof of concept for the product? And I think really, you're kind of mixing up, the different phases of the project, because in the POC, it's really about discovery, right? What's going to work, what doesn't work, being able to quickly change direction, all that'll feed into your product development. But trying to do both of them at the same time, you're probably, not using the best use of energy, to get where you need to go.
Excellent. All right, well, I think as a way to summarize, kind of the next slide would be to reiterate, and obviously I'm interested in your folks' input here too, as well as what at least I heard coming from this dialogue, which would be identify your true goal of a POC, identify the stakeholders, and again, the theme that I heard coming across was avoid having too many stakeholders or even maybe unnecessary stakeholders involved in it. If it's technical in nature, you don't necessarily need the marketing folks. If it's marketing in nature, you could limit the technical folks. Obviously, you need technical folks to build it, but again, you got to know who you're building it for, at least initially. And as part of that, and kind of expand upon that, would be identifying risk factors. And some of them we've talked about throughout, but really, as you're going through it, identify what your potential risks are, not so much from a POC perspective, but as you're considering building the actual product, it'd be great to be able to list those and document those. And at least for me, one of the key benefits I heard from a POC as a part or different from developing a true product, regulatory medical device, would be you can iterate and adjust quickly. You can't iterate with an actual product development cycle, but here you can iterate almost as often as you like, because you're just trying to get it to meet the goal of those end users, as we discussed.
Don't be afraid to kind of break off a small piece of a project and put it into something that goes outside of process so that you can do it right and get the answers you need.
Well, I think at this point, we will turn it over. I think some of you have been queuing up different questions, and we'll go to some of our panelists, and I'll try to go through and read some of those questions and answers, and we'll get to as many or of all of them within the time that we have.